I want to give you the best piece of worship leading advice that you probably don't want to hear. And I want to implore you to not click off this video whenever you hear it, because it's going to be so mind-numbingly obvious that you're going to be like, I already knew that. But I'm telling you that this is the best piece of worship leading advice, practical worship leading advice. I feel like there's practical worship leading advice, and then there's spiritual worship leading advice. Not that spiritual worship leading advice isn't practical, but hopefully you know what I mean. Like, this is something that you can actually do, not just something to think. The best piece of worship leading advice that you don't want to hear is this: plan in advance. The further we can plan in advance, the better our worship leading will be. Simple as that. As a general rule of thumb, not discounting the Holy Spirit's guidance in our worship leading, the further we plan in advance, the better our worship leading can be. Think about this. When are the times when worship leading for you has felt the best? I bet it's when you have put in a lot of work into the actual act of preparing to lead worship leading. I think specifically of like Easter or Christmas, right? By the way, we're getting ready for Christmas right now as of me putting out this video. And so you probably are already thinking about Christmas worship, right? And so a lot of us plan for 2 months, 3 months before our Christmas Eve service or a Christmas Day service, whatever you do at your church, and you put in so much work beforehand, and then you think to yourself on that day, man, that was really, really good. And I wonder why that is. It's because you actually planned for your worship gathering like you were supposed to. The further we plan out for our worship services, the better they are. Contrast that to when somebody has just asked you like last moment to lead worship, and you show up and you didn't even have time to run through the songs. Maybe for some of you, that's every single Sunday. You didn't have time to run through the songs, and you step up there and like worship was fine. By the way, I believe that the Holy Spirit, Jesus' sacrifice, I should say, perfects our worship. And so it's not like one form of worship is better than the other. As long as we do it in spirit and in truth, it is pleasing to God because of what Christ has done for us, the price that he has paid. We don't come to God through our own works, right? I believe that 100%. I'm just saying, for you personally, you will feel better about your worship leading when you plan in advance. You will be more confident. You will feel like you have ministered to your church better because you probably have. And so just plan in advance. I want to talk about 4 ways that planning in advance specifically enhances our worship leading. And I think the overarching idea boils down to this. This is why planning in advance is so powerful. It's what I call the slow cooker theory. The slow cooker theory means that the more time we have to think about and pray about and marinate in an idea for when we're leading worship, or really in anything in life, the better it gets. The more time you have to think about something, the better it will be. And so compare, I got what my pastor is preaching on Friday, and I'm going to pick out the songs, and then I have to lead on Sunday. So I've got one day in between those two to think about what I'm going to do for Sunday. Compare that to, I know on Monday what my pastor's preaching on. And so I have Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 5 days. That's 5 times what you had if you just started on Friday. You have 5 times longer to let your ideas marinate. And I think even beyond that, not just knowing a general idea of what you're going to do on Sunday, but actually planning it early in the week. Not just knowing about it, but actually planning it early in the week and having like, this is my rough draft of the idea for Sunday. These are the songs I'm doing. These are the speaking transitions that I'm going to be doing. These are the special elements that I have in my service, if I have any. Having that ironed out early in the week and letting it marinate in your mind lets things get better. Think about it like with what's a piece of meat that we marinate? Chicken. Would you rather eat a piece of chicken that was marinated for a half an hour or for a day? Would you rather have a piece of chicken that somebody threw some marinade on for 15 minutes and then threw it on the grill? Or would you rather it have sat overnight in the refrigerator, marinating, soaking up all those juices, developing the flavors? That's what happens when we plan in advance. We put the piece of chicken, the worship set, maybe this is getting too weird, we put the raw piece of chicken, the raw worship set, in the marinade of our mind and let it develop flavor, and it gets better. That is the slow cooker theory, or maybe I should call it the marination theory. The slow cooker theory is we throw things in a crock pot and we don't just cook it on high for a half an hour and hope that everything turns out well. We put it on that low setting in the slow cooker and it gets juicy and tender, and we let it cook all day, and then we come home at night and we eat it for dinner, and it's 10 times better than if we just threw it in an hour beforehand. That is the slow cooker or marination theory. Maybe I have two names for that. But that's what you can do when you plan in advance, but you can only do it when you plan in advance. So that's the overarching understanding of planning in advance. Let's talk about some specific ways that that plays out in your worship leading. I already mentioned it, but let's talk about speaking transitions. I think the most obvious way that that slow cooker theory or marination theory shows itself is in our speaking transitions. Do you know what you're going to say for this Sunday? If not, start thinking about it right now, because the idea will get better over time. You have the idea of where you're going to speak. You have the main points in your mind. This is what I think I'm going to communicate to my congregation on Sunday. And then you have that in your mind. By the way, this isn't, I didn't mention this before, but this isn't like a conscious thinking that we're doing. It's not even a thing where like, okay, now I just have time to think about it at a later date. This is something that happens in the back of our minds as we have an idea established. Our minds, while we're sleeping, while we're walking, while we're cooking dinner, while we're working on other things for our worship ministry, our mind is amazing and it works out that idea in the background. That's why you have epiphanies all of a sudden, even when you weren't thinking about something, because there is a conscious part of your mind and there is an unconscious or subconscious, I should say, part of your mind that is working on these long-term problems in the background. It's amazing how God has created our brains, right? So you have the idea and then your subconscious mind is figuring it out in the background. That happens with your speaking transitions. You come up with the one or two points that you're going to communicate, and then once you have it planned out, your brain is automatically working on that in the background. You can only do that if you plan in advance. So that's one way that planning in advance helps our speaking transitions. The other one, I want to point you to a quote that I believe Mark Twain said. He said this, he said, "I don't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one instead." I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long letter instead. And I think that that applies to our worship speaking transitions. I didn't have time to write a short speaking transition, so I wrote a long one instead. How many times have you seen that? I think people think sometimes that if somebody speaks for a longer time during their worship gathering, then they must have really planned it and thought it out. But I want to challenge you that actually, most of the time, the person who spoke for a shorter amount of time was more prepared than the person who spoke for a longer amount of time, because the person who spoke for a longer amount of time didn't have that marination process. They just spewed whatever thoughts were in their head, and they didn't take the time to order those thoughts. That's what Mark Twain means when he says, "I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one instead." He's saying it takes more work to write a short letter. It takes more work to write a short speaking transition or to communicate a short speaking transition. Anybody can ramble for 3 or 4 minutes during a worship set. Only those who are prepared can speak for 30 seconds and still make an impact. So, have you been speaking for way too long because you are not prepared in advance for your speaking transitions? I've been there before. I know I speak for a really long time in these videos, but I'm not somebody who talks a lot. But when I am not prepared for my speaking transitions, I can ramble. And so if I want to overcome that, if you want to overcome that, we need to prepare in advance, because then we have time to write a short, impactful speaking transition. Now, some people say, I can't plan in advance because I need to leave room for the Holy Spirit. I don't like to plan in advance because I like to see the Holy Spirit work, they say, as if they feel holier than everybody else who actually puts in the work beforehand. Well, if we actually trusted in the power of the Holy Spirit, we would understand that he's not just at work on Sunday mornings. You actually belittle the leading, the power of the Holy Spirit if you resign him to leading you on Sunday morning. You're actually making the Holy Spirit smaller in your mind when you say, the Holy Spirit only leads me on Sunday morning, as opposed to thinking, the Holy Spirit is not just with me on Sunday morning when I'm leading, but the Holy Spirit lives inside of me, not just on Sunday mornings, but all throughout the week. Therefore, the Holy Spirit can lead me all throughout the week. And the Holy Spirit can give me an idea for leading worship on a Monday morning, just like he can give me an idea for leading worship when I'm actually leading worship on a Sunday morning. Spontaneity does not equal holiness. I'll say it again. Spontaneity does not equal holiness. I think of the Old Testament temple worship and probably how unspontaneous they were. They had things planned down to the number of birds you had to sacrifice to absolve yourself of sin or to cover up your sin. Like, they planned in advance, and if we look at that picture, like, that is a picture of an attempt. Obviously, it didn't fulfill the full requirement of the law. That's why Jesus came. But it was like such an attempt at holiness, at being set apart. They were not casual about it. They didn't just say, the Holy Spirit will lead me in this moment. They had it planned out in advance. They knew what they were doing. Spontaneity does not equal holiness. So maybe we need to be a little bit more prepared and a little bit less spontaneous, because holiness isn't spontaneity. Holiness, I suppose, also isn't just being prepared in advance, but I think it shows our obedience to God when we put in the work beforehand. So plan in advance. You aren't being unholy. You aren't not trusting the leading of the Holy Spirit. And oftentimes I've planned in advance, and the Holy Spirit, while I'm leading, has said, no, I want you to do this instead. And so I do whatever this instead is. But having a plan is better than not having a plan. So plan in advance, and God is going to honor your obedience. And then planning in advance, this is so powerful for our worship ministries, is that your team is better prepared. It's not just about you having better ideas. It's not just about you speaking to your church better. It's about your team actually being prepared to lead. When do you tell your team the plan for Sunday? Are you letting them work through those processes that I just talked about? Do they have a chance to marinate on what they're doing for Sunday? Or do you just send out the set list on Friday night or the day before rehearsal or whenever it is, and you don't give them enough time to properly prepare? When we plan in advance, the benefit is not just to us, is not just to our congregation that we're leading on Sunday, it's also to our worship team. And they have time more than just the night before to prepare to lead worship. Speaking of having your team prepared, what about having them prepared for worship rehearsal? I've been getting this question a lot lately. How do I get my team to be prepared when they show up at rehearsal? And I think it starts with having a plan for your rehearsal. That's why I want to point you down in the description below to the free PDF I put together called the Worship Rehearsal Blueprint. In that blueprint, I will show you how to lead a worship rehearsal that leads your team well spiritually, so they grow closer to God, relationally, so that they grow closer to each other, and musically, so that they're actually prepared for Sunday. So check that out in the description below. Let's start planning further in advance. If you feel overwhelmed in your worship leading, just plan out a few days further in advance this week and see how it feels. Other than that, until I see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.